India just went from being the 11th largest economy in the world to the 5th. When you think about the fastest growing economies in the world, several countries come to mind, but until recently, India was not one of them. But the Chinese economy is still the more established giant in the Asian market. So the real question is, can India surpass China's growth? Let's find out. India is now competing with countries like Canada, Brazil, Italy, Russia, and France, but that's not what the country is really aiming for. No, the country's got a long-term plan for the future. Experts believe that by 2026, India is all set to go up against Germany, and it might even give Japan a run for its money. But all this didn't come out of nowhere. After the economic reforms in 1991, India grew exponentially. And while some might say that it's relatively slow when you compare it to China's economy, you never know when it might become the next big thing. Some reports suggest that we still got a couple of decades before India becomes the second largest economy after China. So how did they do it? What? Well, the answer is simple. It's because of their incredible growth model.
All this Red Sea drama is bad for the global economy. There's talk of slowdown in 2024, maybe even a recession. But amid this gloom, there is a bright spot, and that's India. And we are not the ones saying this. The IMF is, the International Monetary Fund. They've released the annual assessment of India's economic performance, sort of like a report card. And three things stand out here, three big headlines. Number one, the IMF has called India a star performer, one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Number two, India's GDP will grow by 6.3%. That's the current financial year. 6.3% growth. And number three, India will make up 16% of global economic growth.
You see, as far as numbers go, India's contribution to the global economy has risen to 3.6%, which is more or less the same as position in 2000. Oh, and unlike some other Asian economies reliant on exports, India's growth is largely driven by domestic demand and investments, particularly in infrastructure. This is interesting because it's a lot like the consumer-based models of the US in the 60s and China in the 2000s. India's approach has been so impressive that it pushed their per capita income to $9,000 in 2023, but that's still $9,000 per capita and purchasing power parity. In absolute terms, India still has a long way to go as its GDP per capita stands at just $2,850. The United States' consumer-based approach helps the country avoid recessions, and while India's massive consumer market could be following the same path, it's too soon to say when it'll enjoy the same status as these superpowers. You see, regardless of its high local consumption, India's growth model is showing some Chinese characteristics. Let's return to 2006. In 2006, India launched a marketing campaign at Davos talking about its consistent 6% average annual GDP growth over 15 years, that too under 6 different governments and 5 prime ministers. This campaign aimed to redirect attention from China, which was experiencing double-digit economic growth at the time. Now, 18 years later, India's GDP growth rate is 7.3%, making it the fastest growing major economy. With Prime Minister Narendra Modi in office for the past decade and likely to win a third term, India is increasingly seen as the next big economic powerhouse, especially as Western interest in China slows down. But there's still concern about the structure of India's economy resembling China's because despite following a US-based growth system, local consumption in the economy is still quite low. Lately, they've been relying a bit too much on exports and not putting enough money into their own country. That might sound good for boosting the economy, but it's also making India pile up more debt. But hey, unlike China, India has always been more about spending money at home, which has helped them dodge some of the problems they're facing. But here's the thing, people in India aren't spending as much as they used to. It's slowed down big time, like second slowest in over 20 years kind of slow. And that's a bit worrying, especially now that the crazy spending spree they had after the pandemic is over. Families, especially those with less cash, are feeling the stress and they're turning to borrowing money to get by. Oh, and you know those two-wheelers everyone's always talking about? Yeah, their sales are still not back to what they were before the pandemic hit. Then there's the issue of investment. India's investment in capital has been lower compared to China since its entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. While China consistently invests over 40% of its output, India's investment rate is around 30%, 6% lower than its peak before the 2008 global financial crisis. Even though India has been trying hard to improve its factories and roads, the investment in these sectors isn't as high as it should be. On top of all of that, there's also the problem of unemployment. You see, according to Axis Capital, India's GDP is currently 1.2 years behind its pre-pandemic trajectory. This means that about 14 to 15 million workers who enter the job market every year are currently unable to find employment due to this gap. This situation not only affects the wages of the 21% of workers who rely on employment, but also impacts the incomes of the 39% who run their businesses and the 18% employed by them. Labor in India still lacks the power to keep up with inflation, according to the Axis report. A new investment cycle might lead to GDP growth being higher than consumption growth, with the top 20% of earners experiencing faster growth compared to the bottom 50%. The middle 30% are unlikely to see significant improvements in labor market conditions either, according to some analysts. There's also a prediction by Goldman Sachs that by 2027, 100 million Indians will have incomes of at least $10,000 per year, 5 times the national average. This affluent class, which stood at only 24 million when Modi came to power, explains why he enjoys strong support among the newly wealthy, particularly asset owners. But focusing solely on luxury spending in a thriving stock market may not be the right approach. Growth that doesn't improve the living standards of the majority of workers may not be the most effective strategy in the long run. So with all that in mind, is India going to surpass China? So China is advancing towards the ranks of wealthy nations, while India remains a lower middle income economy with more work to do to attract investment and attention on the global stage. If New Delhi adopts the right strategies, it can attract interest and investment in the future. It seems difficult, but India is doing some things right to surpass China. Let's talk about how India handles money. It's pretty impressive, actually. Even though government banks still have a big say, private banks and other financial companies are stepping up their game. But here's the real star of the show: digital payments. India is killing it on the global stage, especially with this thing called UPI. You can use UPI to transfer money from one account to another in a snap, thanks to apps like PhonePe and Google Pay. And get this, UPI processed over $1 trillion in transactions in 2022.
Since its inception in 2016, UPI has steadily grown in popularity in India. According to RBI data, UPI transactions reached INR 139.2 trillion in financial year 2022-23, accounting for approximately 73% of India's non-cash transactions in 2022. UPI is a global champion, not just in India. Recently, the National Payments Corporation of India (NPCI) International partnered with Singapore's PayNow. This collaboration enables frictionless cross-border transactions using PayNow's virtual payment address (VPA), which is similar to domestic UPI transfers. UPI is currently being used in following countries: India, Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Singapore, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, and Bahrain. But
Brazil even took inspiration and launched something similar called Pix. But it's not just about making payments easier. In places like Kenya, they've revolutionized money with stuff like M-Pesa. With a simple mobile phone, people can send money to each other, boosting spending and fighting poverty in the process. And let's not forget about India's infrastructure. They're expanding roads like crazy, upping airport numbers, and making everything super fancy. That's why India is growing like nobody's business. Let's talk about India's digital journey. It's pretty impressive, ranking just behind Indonesia among a bunch of other big economies. Since 2014, India's really upped its game, with its digital score shooting up by 90%. But hey, there's still a ton of room for improvement. Why does it matter, you ask? Well, think of digital infrastructure as the backbone of a country's growth. It's essential for creating more jobs, making life easier, and helping the government provide essential services to everyone. Here's a fun fact. India's service sector is a big deal, driving almost half of its total economy. And get this, India is not just selling services at home, it's also a major player in the global market, making up a huge chunk of what it exports. But here's the thing, despite making big bucks from its exports, India is only employing a fraction of its huge workforce. With over 900 million potential workers, it's surprising that only about 60 million have proper jobs.
Hasbro is famous for its Monopoly board game, and Mattel makes the Barbie doll. They make some of their toys in India. Now they want to expand. So what's holding them back? To understand that, we must understand the business of toys. Manufacturing is dominated by China. It is the biggest toy maker in the world. More than 70% of the world's toys are made in China. And what is China's share in exports? 56%. So more than half of the toys made in China are sent overseas, mostly to the West. Let me show you some more numbers. These are from 2023. From January to September. We'll start with the US. 79% of toys sold in America were Chinese. It's as if the rest of the world just stopped making toys. All the manufacturing went to China. The reasons are well known. China was cheap, it had a large capacity, so factories could churn out more toys in less time.
So while India's digital game is strong, there's still a lot of work to do to make sure everyone benefits from it. India needs to create more blue-collar jobs, especially in the manufacturing sector, to be able to overtake China. They've long aimed to become a global manufacturing powerhouse, but its share of manufacturing output has remained slow around 17 to 18% and is now at an all-time low. But certain segments like pharmaceuticals, electrical machinery, and vehicles have seen a 63% increase in exports over the past 5 years. The Make in India initiative is aimed at boosting exports by promoting manufacturing. But instead of focusing on local manufacturing, India is increasingly resorting to protectionist measures. Instead, India needs to be embracing an export-oriented strategy. These policies, driven by nationalist sentiments, lower competitiveness in the global market and slow down integration into supply chains. Despite these challenges, large companies like Adani, Reliance Industries, Tata, and JSW plan to invest over $250 billion in infrastructure and emerging industries, aligning with government objectives. While concerns about excessive corporate power exist, these firms' profits contribute only 0.7% to the national GDP, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem. India's economic growth is largely focused on physical capital, like infrastructure, but there's a need for investments in human capital, especially given its super young population. With around 500 million people under 20, India's demographic dividend could drive economic growth, but access to quality education remains a challenge. So can India overtake China's economic giant status? The answer isn't a simple yes or no. India has tremendous potential for growth with its young population and growing tech sector. However, significant hurdles exist, like infrastructure development and improving business regulations. China's established manufacturing base and massive investments are hard to beat. The future is uncertain. India might close the gap, but surpassing China completely in the near future might be a bit of a challenge. Still, India's economic rise is undeniable, and it's sure to be a major player on the world stage for decades to come. Until then, make sure to click on this next video to find out more about what's going on in the global economy.